Hi, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of our IAGB Youth Talk series. Through this newly formed IAGB Youth team, students like us are able to discuss interesting or controversial or even under-discussed topics, such as the research on Asian elephants that we're going to talk about today. I'm Shori Gupta alongside Nipun Gol and Sarina Chan. We are pleased to be joined by Dr. De Silva. And then, yeah, we can go and introduce ourselves. I'm a junior in high school. I enjoy these podcasts, and I also enjoy reading about neuroscience. Nipun?
Hi everyone, my name is Nipun. If you don't know me right now, I'm a rising senior from Franklin, Massachusetts, and I love to play the trumpet as well as football.
I'm Serena. I'm a rising ninth grader at Newton South, and I love talking, which is why I do these podcasts, and I love singing.
Okay, Dr. De Silva, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. So my name is Shermin De Silva, and I run Trunks and Leaves, which is a conservation nonprofit focused on Asian elephants and their habitats. I'm based in San Diego, but I've worked for a very long time in Sri Lanka, which I'm originally from, and I run a research project there called the Uruwalwe Elephant Research Project, which follows the lives of wild Asian elephants in Uruwalwe National Park.
Yeah, it's actually a really interesting topic because a lot of the research nowadays has focused on African elephants and um, not as much on Asian elephants. And I think that's another important reason why studies like these need to be more discussed and more brought out amongst the community. Could you talk to us a little bit more about what your research entails?
So I'm more of an ecologist by training, and more specifically a behavioral ecologist by training. So I'm interested in animal behavior and why animals do what they do. And more recently, I've also been directing the research towards more of the social sciences and human side of things, and why people behave the way that people do. Um, and the research project is unique for Asian elephants in that it follows individually identified Asian elephants. So, we recognize hundreds of animals in the park in the same way that, we recognize people, or we use photographs primarily to identify them. And we keep track of day to day who's seen with who, and whenever there is a birth or a death or important events and things like that. And that is the basis for all kinds of things like estimating the population size and their birth rates and death rates, and how well the population is doing, and also long-term social dynamics, just something that I'm interested in kind of as an ongoing thing. Why elephants basically behave with, have make friends with the individuals that they have friends, and why they, how they use resources, and whether that might have something to do with how they interact. And back when I started, I was also interested in communication. So the communication, sort of the repertoire of Asian elephants hadn't been very well described. So and now I'm also interested in the potential for using acoustics to survey and monitor populations that may be more difficult to observe. And then, as I mentioned, more recently, we've been studying the human communities to try to understand their livelihoods and economic conditions and attitudes and perceptions, and how they view elephants, what they think about elephants, and what it really feels like, what it means to live with elephants, and and how can we expect people to live with potentially dangerous animal that is obviously a very big economic burden for people who live with them. So those are the different facets of the work that we do.
Yeah, that's awesome. So you started your work in Sri Lanka, your field-based research. What brought you to the US then?
I moved to the US actually as a kid. So I grew up in the US from the age of 10 or so. And I pretty much went to school here, and I wasn't particularly looking to work on elephants as such, but I was interested um, in studying something that I could work on in Sri Lanka, because it just seemed naturally like a way for me to go back home where I still had ties. And I also felt like if I was going to do anything anywhere, in the I didn't need to go to necessarily to an exotic location somewhere that I had never been, because pretty much the jungle of Sri Lanka was exotic. When I was growing up, the whole time that I was a kid, my family, we didn't really explore the outdoors, and I didn't really even know like what the national parks were like, because we were pretty much in the city the whole time. And so for me, it was a whole just discovery of what would have been in my own backyard, not literally, but that was home. So that was a way for me to get to know um, a place that I should have known. I felt like I should have known. And the same is true for Asian elephants. I felt like that was an animal that I had grown up kind of seeing around in festivals and on TV and in the zoo, and in as a big part of the kind of culture, and 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 I just really didn't think too much about it. And I think um, it's Asian elephants sort of get viewed as like sort of like kind of like horses or donkeys or something like that. They're just kind of present, and I didn't recognize growing up that they were actually an endangered species. And it was only later, like after college, when I was looking for graduate programs, that I actually looked into Asian elephants, and I was really shocked that they were endangered. And I think that's probably true of a lot of people. And so the fact that there's so little awareness was something that motivated me to work on Asian elephants.
Yeah, that's great work, Dr. Silva. Of course, through these elephants, we can make so many different observations and such. And I was just wondering, from all the different research that you've done, what has been kind of the driving factor or the goal to continue in the research or expand? Has it been about that endangered status that elephants have? And then from that research, have you gathered any information that kind of uh, has benefited the elephant community in a good way, whether it be through the social dynamics or just their behavior in general?
So the first part of the question, what motivates? I think, I think elephants are interesting just from in so many different ways. They have this, I think, rightly well-earned reputation for being socially complex and interesting, and that was the first thing that kind of drew me to them. And that's a sort of ongoing academic interest. Why if this is an animal that is the largest land mammal, and they need a lot of space, and they don't have any big predators aside from us. So elephants behave in very intentional and very deliberate ways, and they're very thoughtful about what they do, and so it gives you a lot. It gives you a sense that there's a lot going on under the hood. And so it's always a sort of puzzle to try to figure elephants out. And because elephants do things in what I call elephant time, it takes a very long time to figure out what's going on, because they live on they have long lifespans. So you really need to study something like an elephant for a very long time to see interesting things, and to try and to even just understand what drives things like their social behavior or their population dynamics. Um, I think if there's one sort of value in what we're doing, it is precisely that. It's having that long window, which for Asian elephants, unfortunately, there are just very few studies like that, very very little research like that. And so from a scientific standpoint, we are able to see that Asian elephants are different from African elephants in how they behave, and when we look in more detail. There are some studies also now in India that are several years ongoing, And it's interesting to compare different populations in Sri Lanka, in India, and Africa, and with African elephants. And so our study is kind of a starting point. There are other studies now that that also are building up the body of knowledge and research. Um, so from a conservation standpoint, I think it's very difficult to have an impact just because we're a very small organization and at the scale that we're working. And I think it's an unfortunate thing that we have to compete for, like, the attention and the resources with much larger organizations, and Asian elephants are not necessarily a priority for many conservation groups, and so there is much less visibility. So to the extent that we can, um, my goal is to just push for conservation policies and management policies for elephants to be based on science, like, and to be what I would call evidence-based, and that means not just based on politics or what people think should happen or is convenient, or but that's difficult. It's a very it's an uphill challenge, and so if there is any value in what we're doing, I would hope that that's where it is. I can't point to, unfortunately, I can't point to specific examples and say, here, that's where this work fit in. It's kind of more diffuse. I mean, the work goes into things like most recently the Red List assessment, which is by the IUCN every 10 years compiles an assessment of all these species that are classified as either threatened or endangered or vulnerable or whatever. And our research, hopefully gets looked at by conservationists and policymakers and practitioners when they're trying to decide how to manage elephants. But that's that's one side of it, and on the other side, I'm trying to use that kind of research and the understanding of elephants to just generally influence the way that people think about Asian elephants and how they value elephants. And everyone kind of agrees that elephants are cute, but again, this problem of not necessarily knowing that elephants are endangered, and and how slowly they breed, and understanding that wild elephants really need to be preserved in the wild. It's not captive elephants and captive breeding that are necessarily the answer right now, at least. So just kind of constantly putting the message out there that Asian elephants need our help, and what you can do.
Yeah, definitely. Along with the scientists who would potentially look at your research, I think, you know, countries in and around the Indian subcontinent, like India, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, and all those countries, that's where those Asian elephants are naturally presiding. And I think, especially in India, those Asian elephants are, held religiously in regard. So I think that research in conserving those elephants and assembling all that data, I think that definitely has higher implications too. You know, I'm not sure if you mentioned this earlier, but is there an emotional aspect that you resonate with when you research Asian elephants, since they're typically in your home country?
Um, yeah, well, as a scientist, you're kind of trained to not be too emotionally attached, or with what you're doing. I think, and I try not to be, insofar as individual elephants go. Like, there are some that just from my time when I was in the field that were endearing, um, but I think just it's more at a species level, that there's this, among elephant people, elephant researchers, if there's a saying that once an elephant person, like always an elephant person. It's kind of a species that once you start studying, it's difficult to look somewhere else. And yeah, I think they are captivating, and I think for example, when I see monkeys out in the field, there are tons of primatologists who study monkeys, and I think to myself, they look so small. How can you see anything? How can you keep track of what they're doing? They're so fast. Elephants are these huge, ponderous, slow moving objects that I'm kind of used to working at the pace of an elephant. Um, and there are things that sometimes elephants do that make you feel like there is a certain touch of something that you can recognize, something that you can relate to. So for example, relationships between mothers and calves. Some years ago, I posted a video of a calf throwing a tantrum, and for all intents and purposes, the mother it was right there, but just ignoring the baby until the baby became such a nuisance that she had to pay attention and sort of apologize to everyone else in the group. I mean, that was not, there's no language involved, but the body language and what was going on, was just so hilarious. And there are other, sort of incidents like this where you kind of feel like there are more, if you could just understand all of the the levels at which they're operating, it would be a far richer experience. And it's already, knowing individuals as we do and knowing the relationships between them, when we see them behave, it already is a richer experience than just an anonymous animal that you see in a drive-through, like for 5 minutes. um it's, yeah, the more you know about them, the more you want to know. Mhm.
Yeah, and I would definitely agree with that. There's always some sort of connection that you would have with the research you're doing at even at such a personal level. But I've heard that Asian elephants, along with other elephants like African elephants, they're keystone species. Could you describe, what a keystone species is to our audience?
Yeah, so a keystone species is this concept in conservation and in ecology that so a keystone literally is a stone that is part of an arch, and it's the very last stone that you put in at the top that sort of holds the arch up. And a keystone species, by extension of that metaphor, is a species that sort of is very central to other species in that ecosystem, and has a lot of other relationships that if you were to remove that keystone, the whole ecosystem might change or collapse in the same way that if you remove the keystone, the arch would collapse. And so this concept is very widely applied to often to charismatic species. So things like otters and wolves, but also species like starfish that are not necessarily very charismatic, unless you study starfish. Maybe you think they are. But they have the ability to dramatically alter ecosystems. So elephants, yeah, they are, big. So you can imagine that, but any big organism probably has an outsized impact on the ecosystem. So elephants, obviously, they eat lots of things and they poop, and what comes out the other end, So what goes in must come out, and so. Just by virtue of doing that, they change the structure of ecosystems. They decide, what kinds of plants grow there, and what kinds of seeds are dispersed, and how far, so they can disperse things further away than most other animals that are at least that are on land. And then they also, pull things up, destroy things, dig holes, and they modify the environment. So um, for this reason, they've also been referred to as ecosystem engineers. Another sort of keystone engineer is something like a beaver that can dramatically alter the environment. Um, and then there are other terms that you can apply. Flagship species. So a flagship species is like a species that represents the biodiversity. And to me, elephants also are sort of representatives of those ecosystems. So not only are they like a key component of the ecosystem, where if you were to remove them, the whole ecosystem would probably change. but they also represent lots of different types of diverse ecosystems because they are what you call generalists. They're habitat generalists. So they can eat lots of different types of plants, so that, and they can tolerate lots of different types of conditions, ecological conditions, whether it's fairly dry, like in parts of India, or really moist rainforests, like you get in Southeast Asia. So they have a really broad range of environments that they can live in. So for all of these reasons, elephants are sort of like symbols of these different ecosystems, and they're also key players in those ecosystems.
Yeah, and that definitely makes your research that much more significant. Topics like these that are not as popular amongst the youth, they get low traction, and then people don't realize how important these species are to a certain environment's ecology. So what's some of the harmful impacts that the humans are having on elephants that are causing their numbers to dwindle?
So the number one challenge for elephants and many of the other species in those environments is just the habitat loss itself. So changes in land use, and the constant sort of eating away of wild habitat by human activities. And that's happening all throughout the range, and and it's happening when we say habitat. That doesn't affect just elephants, right? It affects everything else, including the plants, right? The forests, and with elephants, it's a bit of a even more of a challenge, because unlike many smaller species that might just disperse or die when the habitat is lost, elephants tend to stick around. Either that or they move. They don't just keel over and die right away, so they don't go out without a fight, right? And literally what that means is we have conflict, so-called human-elephant conflict, as a result. And I see human-elephant conflict really as just that. It's a symptom of the underlying changes that are happening, that the animals are trying to adjust to, and then conflict, what we call conflict, is a result of there being negative impacts from the elephants on people, but then people also have negative impacts that can result in the deaths of elephants and the deaths of people, either because people are intentionally killing them or because they're accidentally being killed by things like falling down wells or getting electrocuted or what have you. And all of that is that's what you see on the surface. But then the work the research that I've done, in our population, and also combined with work that people have done in places like Myanmar and in other places, we see that elephants don't breed very well in many places now. So an elephant can produce a calf once in every 3 years tops, because it has a 2-year gestation period, and then it has to be on milk for a while. So optimally, an elephant can breed every 4 years. A female can breed every 4 years. But what we see in Ottawa through our long-term observations is that most of the population breeds, half the population has like a 6-year gap. And then that means that half of the population has a even longer gap between calves. It might be as long as 9 or 10 years. I was just updating a record, and I saw that one of families that we know really well had they live entirely within the protected area, so they should be pretty safe, right? They should have all the food they need. They're not under any threats or pressure. But the youngest female in that family, who just had her first baby in like 2011, had her second baby last year. So there's like a 9-year gap between those two babies. And so imagine that, when we have conditions where we have an increase in elephant deaths, whether it's adults or calves, and you have such a long time for them to reproduce, it's very difficult for populations to absorb that. And so one of the deep challenges is that um, when elephants disappear, it may happen so slowly and imperceptibly because they can live a long time and they breed so slowly. People kind of get accustomed to seeing elephants in the landscape, and then they may gradually disappear. But it happens over a long time scale or many generations. But because of that slow breeding rate, even if the elephants don't disappear right away, they might be on a downward trajectory that is difficult to turn around. And so all of the impacts that we see are having these, sort of invisible consequences potentially for elephant populations. And that's very difficult to convey, and it's very difficult to act around. It's much easier to sort of rouse people when it's something like poaching, or in the case of African elephants, right? The ivory trade has had a huge impact on African elephants, much less so in the recent past on Asian elephants. It has been historically had a huge impact on Asian elephants, but on Asian elephants, because only the males have tusks, and as you probably have seen in India, not all males have tusks, so it's only a fraction of the population. So the ivory trade in and of itself, it can't completely eliminate elephants because the females never have tusks, and then there's always the tuskless males that can sort of fill the gap, right? But habitat loss, that affects everybody. Other kinds of poaching, like we saw an emerging problem of poaching for skin in Myanmar, that can affect all age groups. And things that affect the quality of the environment. So if you have degraded habitat where the females don't have enough food to eat, they're not producing enough milk, that impacts the calves. So these kinds of effects, which are much more difficult to convey to the public and also difficult to sort of rally people around, because they act on a slower time scale and it's hard to see. So those are the negative impacts on elephant populations.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of impacts as you outlined, Dr. Silva, and it's easy to feel like in such a broad issue with that many challenges that there's not much really we can do to kind of further the issue or make our voices heard. So what would you say is something we can do to either kind of get people to rally around this issue or just convey the message in a more effective way that this challenge is happening and that there are things that we can potentially do to limit our limit the negative effects that we have on elephants?
Yeah. So it depends on where you are, right? And I think one of the challenges again with Asian elephants is that if you're abroad, if you're not in a range country, it's very difficult to see, what you can do that's direct. But what you can do, and it's more general advice because it affects not just elephants but everything else, is just as a step one, your consumption habits and trying to be a responsible consumer, because all our products nowadays come from somewhere far away, right? And it is extremely difficult to be responsible. But to the extent that you can, trying to buy products that are responsible and sustainably sourced. That's step number one. But of course, goes hand in hand with, if you have the ability to get active, to be active. There is the individual action, which is what you can do day to day, but then there's the collective action, which is what we need, policymakers and governments and our representatives, our elected leaders to do, right? And so when it may seem very diffuse, but when we put people in charge here who care about climate change, that affects elephants and everything else, right? So we want to express our voice as citizens and try to put people in office that have environment high on their agenda. And then for another group of people, if you're if you're a business person, for example, having sustainability not just be a sort of nice to have and not just be sort of like an add-on or a greenwash, but really thinking about how you can be more sustainable and lower your own footprint. That would be those are things that people can do that are not necessarily directly on the front lines. but if you are, for example, if you're watching this from a country where you do have elephants, then I think civic engagement in that locality is even just as important. So um, we have so many instances now of various development projects and various programs that are have these negative impacts on the ecosystems, and so being active in those situations and uh, and supporting organizations that are active in those situations, I think that's something else that people can do. And then when you travel, travel responsibly, as we have resources on our website for these for whenever the world reopens and people are traveling again, experiencing wildlife in a responsible way.
Yeah, we can definitely put a link to the website in the description of the video. So if you would like to, you can go check that out later. Are there any other questions or thoughts that you would want to say now?
Um, I'm curious what you all would hope to, what would you like to achieve with a program like this, and is there and how else can what do you think would be useful for us to do to reach more young people? Um, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I would always say is social media, you know, reaching out to different organizations like IAGB Youth, that I think that kind of reach will always get, you know, further and further over time. You know, we always have our word of mouth that typically works a lot because I think people like to trust, you know, what the people who are they're close with. They typically, you know, learn more, take more action based off of that. I don't know. Those are just my thoughts.
Yeah, no, that's good. I think you already touched on the political standpoint that you guys are trying to achieve, and I think just that continued attempts would be good, especially as we see people my age and younger starting to get a lot more politically involved than they have been in years past. So just reaching out to certain organizations that are already connected with climate change, such as the Sunrise Movement. There are other chapters throughout the nation, and kind of partnering with them, I think that would be extremely effective. Also just getting in touch with more lawmakers, even on the local level. Any change, as you said, is important change. And I think that would be one of the most effective ways to get positive results.
Yeah, I agree with Storia and Nippon. Definitely social media platforms and organizations. And also, I think it's important to, I know a lot of people say that, but to like spread awareness and like telling people things like people don't expect climate change to affect elephants, but if we can spread more of that, then I think that would be an important thing that'll make more people care more about this issue.
All right.
Yeah, no, definitely. I enjoyed this talk with Nippo and Serena and definitely Dr. De Silva. You know, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. Thank you for inviting me. I look forward to your airing this episode, and please let me know, and we'll share it on the networks as well.
Yep. Thank you everybody for tuning in.
Um,
See you next time in our next episode.